Mayor, welcome back. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as you well know, Bibi Netanyahu is in town even as an ICC arrest warrant looms over his head, and the ICJ has just ruled that the West Bank settlements are illegal. This has raised all sorts of questions, but in particular, we wanted to talk to you about how you are viewing the shift from Joe Biden to Vice President Harris as the presumptive Democratic nominee. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen from Baraka Ravid, how Vice President Harris is handling this Bibi visit this week. So apparently she is expected to meet with the Israeli Prime Minister at the White House separately from Biden later this week. However, she conveniently had a conflict in terms of his speech to the Senate, so she will not be in the Senate. She will not be presiding over the Senate for that speech. So, what do you make so far of Vice President Harris's views with regard to Israel and whether or not she may be in lockstep with Joe Biden's genocidal support of the Israeli assault on Gaza, or whether she may create some distance between herself and the way he has approached the issue?
I think the idea that she won't be seated behind the war criminal Netanyahu as he's addressing Congress is a positive step. Whether that decision was made recently or previously, it really waits to be seen. As it pertains to the private conversation and the talking points that you had on the screen, I think what's really lacking is the further emphasis on the need for the Palestinians to have a right to self-determination. And the idea now that the ICJ has really provided Vice President Kamala Harris with the shield and the sword to be on the offensive in those conversations with Benjamin Netanyahu in private, to talk about the need for Israel's withdrawal of Gaza and the West Bank and the end of the occupation, to talk about potentially an offensive arms embargo and how we actually achieve a lasting permanent ceasefire with the ultimate hope of a just Palestinian state. So I think there's still a lot left to be seen on the table, and I'm hoping that there's a departure though, from the current course that has been charted by President Biden. I think really now there's an opportunity for Vice President Harris to demonstrate that there's a clear, distinctual difference between where she stands on the issue and where the current president stands on the issue.
For Michigan voters who are concerned about Gaza, how much does her link to the current administration make it impossible for her to make her case versus how willing are people to say, look, Vice President doesn't actually have much say over what's going on. Let's hear what she has to say. What are you hearing from people?
People, I would say that the door is open. I'm not going to say that the door is wide open, but there might be a crack in this door that's open that Biden once had closed. And what people are saying, at least the constituents and the conversations that I've been a part of, is that they want the vice president, who is the presumptive Democratic national, who's going to be the presumptive Democratic nominee, to come out and willfully and boldly say and declare that she would like to see a permanent ceasefire. She would like an offensive arms embargo on the state of Israel, given the ICJ and the ICC rulings, that she wants the unfettered access to humanitarian aid, and that she's going to distance herself further from Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet of war criminals. And so I think these are the talking points and the policy decisions that people are eager to hear from the presumptive Democratic nominee.
There's a lot of reading of the tea leaves of some of the comments she has made, even as vice president, and also some reading of the tea leaves of some of the internal reports that she had been somewhat of a dissenter, that she had at least, had some concern for Palestinian human rights, that, we've just never really seen any empathy from President Joe Biden when it comes to Palestinians. You can put this up on the screen. Several of the ex-Biden administration officials who had resigned over his Israel policy say they are more hopeful about how VP Harris would handle the war in Gaza if she were president. One of those individuals said, quote, "Frankly, it's hard to imagine any Democrat having a worse approach to the genocide than Biden, given his complete resistance to any shift over the last 10 months. So, Mayor, how are you reading those signs, given Kamala Harris's public remarks and some of the reports that have come out from her role inside the White House?
I think hopeful is the right word here. I feel the same way, and many constituents and people are eager to feel that way as well. Ultimately, what what's going to drive people to come out and cast their ballot in November is hope, the hope of having an aspiring candidate who can depart from the decades-old Democratic foreign policy agenda that has led us to endless wars and the unfolding genocide now in Gaza. And so if we want to advance transformative domestic policy that centers working people, that centers people's humanitarianism, at the same time, we need to have a foreign policy that's reflective of the same dignity that we have for Americans, that we should eliminate these geographic borders and say what we want for Americans, we'd also love for others around the globe to have, including Palestinians, those in Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem. And so, again, we're hopeful. It's in the early days. And I think time will tell where exactly Vice President Harris falls on these issues. I think she is walking a tightrope, knowing that she still is the vice president to President Joe Biden. We know very much where he stands on these issues. At the same time, she needs to create space as the presumptive nominee to demonstrate that she differs from the president on this issue.
You know, one key question I think will be outreach, and this is only her second full day as the presumptive nominee, and she had spent a lot of time kind of sewing up the delegates for the nomination. But I'm curious if you've heard from anybody in the Michigan community who has gotten outreach, you know, from either the vice president herself or from people in her circle with some sort of an olive branch.
You know, I can say that months ago I was in contact with the vice president's team. And this is prior to any assumption that the president may step down as Democratic nominee. And it was a conversation where the messaging felt more empathetic and sympathetic to what was unfolding for the Palestinians. And I know folks in the community are now beginning to receive calls and invitations to participate in roundtables and to really hopefully have our thoughts jotted down, not only at the table, but also in policy. And so we're hopeful to see what this next month and a half, 2 months prior to the convention demonstrates. And obviously the long time between now and November. And as we're seeing, each day brings an exciting new announcement of what's happening and unfolding on this presidential campaign trail. Each day seems to be a world of events unfolding. And so I can't tell you what tomorrow holds, but I think we're all eager to see what happens.
Lastly, I want to put, Abby Martin tweeted this. You know, I brought up the sort of hopeful signs for Kamala Harris. Let me bring up the not so hopeful signs for Kamala Harris. Abby Martin put this together. She says, Biden leaves off as a disgraced war criminal, but let's make no illusions about where Kamala stands on Israel. And then she ticks off regular AIPAC speaker, compared Selma and the U.S. civil rights struggle to her pro-Israel activism, called BDS anti-Semitic, co-sponsored a resolution against Obama in support of illegal settlements. Former campaign director says her support for Israel is central to who she is. She hosted a White House event promoting Israel's atrocity propaganda about October 7th. After calling for immediate ceasefire in March, she then clarified she just meant Biden's temporary pause. Biden officials say, quote, there's no dispute on policy between Biden and Harris on Gaza. I'd love for you to reflect on some of those pieces, but also, you know, is it your sense that Joe Biden is just sort of at the center of Democratic opinion, Democratic Party opinion on Israel? Or is it your sense that he's uniquely bad and any just sort of normal run-of-the-mill Democrat would at least have more skepticism and more willingness to use the levers of power when it comes to Bibi Netanyahu in particular?
I think President Biden was one of the most extreme cases. And I think if we've noticed anything over the last 10 months is that the center of the party has certainly moved on this issue. The plurality of Democrats, of independents, of Republicans have all been calling for a permanent ceasefire. Plurality believe that what's unfolding to be a genocide, yet we have not seen our president move with the center of the party, although he's done that in previous years as time as senator when really critical issues have changed over time. And so for the vice president, I'm very much aware of her history and her track record, either as U.S. Senator or currently now as Vice President. And I think, though, for the community, you know, the anti-war community, the pro-justice community, Arab community, or Muslim community, we are not blind to the idea that more than likely we're going to have a pro-Israeli president, somebody who strongly believes in the allyship with the Israeli government, regardless of who the prime minister or the cabinet is that is in power. That is just de facto going to be the case. And I think what we're trying to do now is begin to create the room to charter a new course, one that uplifts more than just a two-state policy, but that actually inks and is willing to put pen to paper to talk about an exact timeline about how we actually achieve a just state for the Palestinian people, but how we hold the Israeli Israeli cabinet accountable, about how we usher in the ICC and ICJ rulings and make sure that international law is actually upheld and respected. Because more than just the genocide that's unfolding that's at stake is also America standing on the global stage, which has been ceded greatly and tremendously over these last 10 months under the current president.
And my colleague Jeremy Scahill over at Dropsite News wrote on this topic yesterday, if we can put this up on the screen. And he dug up this really extraordinary quote that I wanted to get your response to. It's from a private AIPAC conference in 2018. Kamala Harris was asked why she's so adamant in her support for Israel. She said, quote, "It's just something that has always been a part of me. I don't know when it started. It's almost like saying, when did you first realize you loved your family or loved your country? It was always there. It was always there." You can kind of read that in two ways. One being like, oh, wait, I don't have an answer for this.
It sounds very Trumpian,
and just
you know?
Kind of, yes.
Like, which Bible verse do you like? Well, really, all of them.
The Bible's, and it's so private to me. So on the one hand, it could sound like that, like she'd never actually, didn't have an answer for that question, had never thought about it. On the other hand, it's wildly over the top. Curious, from your perspective, you were probably quite used to seeing the over-the-top statements of support for Israel from Democratic candidates over the years. How much stock do you put in rhetoric like that, given just how kind of pervasive it is?
You obviously, it carries some weight. Tonality carries weight. The verbiage, the words that are used carries weight. But I think what I'm trying to do now, not only for the sake of the community I represent, but for the sake for the public, the broader public at large, as well as what's happening in the Palestinian Gaza and West Bank and Jerusalem, is that I'm trying to create room to have a conversation to see if there's a willingness to chart a new course. I think what I don't have the luxury of doing is sitting on the sideline and just writing off any individual saying, well, the previous decision-making has demonstrated that there is no room for change. We have to create room for change, whether that's through pressure points such as the uncommitted movement, whether it's through pressure points like you saw, calling on President Biden to step down, or now knowing that this is going to be a very tight race, meaning there might be opportunities to strike deals at the policy decision-making table about how you coalesce a coalition of groups that wants to usher in a pro-justice, anti-war era. And to do so, that means there must be a stark difference and a new center for the Democratic Party on this policy of Israel and Palestine.
I did come up with, one more question for you, but I was just curious if you've thought about the potential vice presidential contenders who've been floated as being on the Harris ticket. A few of the top ones you can think of are actually Tim Walz, who's the governor of Minnesota, popped up in one. A bunch of governors. Mark Kelly is another one, Arizona senator. Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania. Roy Cooper, North Carolina. Andy Beshear of Kentucky. J.B. Pritzker of Illinois are some of the names that have been floating around. I think Gretchen Whitmer, your own governor, is mentioned occasionally, though less often than some of those others. Wonder, do you have an opinion on where any of those contenders might stand vis-a-vis Gaza?
I think there's a few governors, and I won't specify, I think the news speaks for itself, who have made remarks as it pertains to potentially comparing the protesters on college campuses to the KKK.
That would be Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, yes.
They very, dystopian comparison to draw, and something that is absolutely not supportive of by many of us in the progressive movement on the left or in the urban Muslim American community. I think, I leave it to the VP to vet who she believes to be her strongest nominee in order for her to have the best chance coming this November. But what I would say is, there's a coalition that is fractured. The coalition that ensured that President Biden received the winning amount of electoral votes 4 years ago. That coalition needs to be brought back together. But in order for that to happen now, the Democratic Party needs to be more than just a big tent party. It needs to be a party that actually puts pen to paper and ushers a new era in policy. Whether that's domestic policy, global policy, we have to talk about where the new center of the party is and make sure that those values are reflected in the policy agenda that we put forward. I personally, we've taken a lot of criticism over the last 10 months for having the gall to say that we put people over party and people over president. But I firmly believe that as Democrats, we should be a party that's not a cult. We don't follow an individual just because that individual may be popular. What we rather do is put our values at the forefront and lead in that manner. And that's what we're trying to do now. So regardless of who the presumptive nominee is, our values have not changed. We want to see a permanent ceasefire. We want to see unfettered access to humanitarian aid. We want to see an arms embargo on the Israeli government, especially given that war crimes are being filed and charged against the prime minister and many of his cabinet members. And we want to see a just Palestinian state because a return to the status quo is unacceptable. So these are the values, at least on the global policy front, as it pertains to this one issue, as well as we also care on many domestic issues, whether it's expanding access to healthcare, ushering a new green era, ensuring that our children, our grandchildren have access to a healthy future, talking about small business policy and centering workers' rights. So there's so much that we want to discuss and address, but the values should take center stage. And this idea of just following personalities has to really fall to the wayside.
Mayor, so grateful for your time this morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you again for having me.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.